Mocking laughter has a sound you don't forget. It isn't even loud all the time. Sometimes it's polite, clipped, dressed up in perfume and confidence, and it still lands the same way, like someone just decided you're small enough to step over. And that day, on the 42nd floor of ArcLight Industrial Partners in Midtown Manhattan, that sound bounced off marble and glass and money, and it landed right on me. I sat there with my old leather briefcase on my lap, the one my dad gave me before I left for business school, worn corners, soft handle, the kind of thing people with real power don't carry anymore because they don't need to prove they've ever worked for anything. And across the table, Sloan Wexler, the head of people operations, tapped her nails like she was counting down the seconds until I disappeared from her day. Her suit looked like it had its own security detail, and when she flipped my resume like it was something sticky, she smiled and said, "With those bargain shoes, you think you belong in our boardroom." My name is Claire Hale. I was 35. I'd built a sustainability company called Green Pulse Strategies into something real, something valuable, something that hired people, paid salaries, and made a measurable dent in waste and cost at the same time. I'd also graduated top of my class from Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the paper in front of them said all of that in clean black ink. But none of it mattered because my blazer wasn't shiny enough, my shoes didn't announce a brand, and I didn't walk in like the building already owed me rent. I answered anyway, calmly, because I've learned that the moment you raise your voice in a room like that, they stop hearing words and start hearing proof that they were right to judge you. So I told them about growth, valuation, systems, how we made sustainability profitable instead of preachy. And for 1 second the room went quiet, the kind of quiet you get when truth interrupts a performance. Then Sloan leaned back, sweet as a knife, and said, "And yet, Green Pulse Strategies couldn't close its final funding round last year. That's unfortunate." And beside her, the CFO, Damon Price, didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just watched me like a man watching a door to make sure it stays locked. I held my posture. I held my breath. I held my briefcase a little tighter, and I said what was true. We hit an economic wall. We learned. We adapted. Failure teaches you things success never will. And Sloan laughed again. No warmth, no humor, just dominance. Then she flicked my resume back onto the table like it might infect her, and said, "We'll be in touch," which in corporate English means, "Please evaporate." I started to gather my papers, slow, deliberate, because dignity is sometimes the only thing you can control, and then the conference room door swung open. He walked in like the building recognized him, tall, silver hair, that calm authority you can't fake, the kind people practice for decades and still never earn. And this was Miles Arclight, the CEO of ArcLight Industrial Partners, the man everyone in this room had been performing for even when he wasn't there. His eyes swept the table, stopped on me, and his whole face shifted, like a memory just grabbed him by the collar. "Claire," he said, and the room didn't just go quiet, it changed temperature. Sloan's confident smile cracked, Damon's jaw tightened, and I stood, because in that second I understood something they didn't. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply recognized. "Hello, Miles," I said, and I swear the first honest emotion I'd felt in that room was the tiny, unwilling amusement of realizing I had walked into their little audition wearing the wrong costume, and still somehow ended up holding the script. Miles crossed the room, ignored the panel like they were decorative furniture, shook my hand, and kept one steadying hand on my shoulder, not as a show, not as pity, as protection, and he turned to them with a short laugh that didn't sound friendly. "Know each other," he repeated, looking straight at Sloan. "I've known her entire life. Her father, Leonard Arclight, was my mentor, my closest friend for 30 years, and then he dropped the line that made everyone's spine sit up straight. And I'm surprised you didn't recognize the founder's daughter, especially since she now owns 51% of this company, as of 2 weeks ago, and will be stepping in as board chair." The silence after that was almost funny, not because it was harmless, but because you could hear their brains scrambling for the emergency exits. Sloan went pale like someone pulled a plug, Damon's eyes narrowed into calculation, and Evelyn Zhao, the talent director, looked down at her notes like she'd been praying for this moment, but didn't want to admit it out loud. "But her last name," Sloan stammered, and I set my old briefcase on the glass table with a soft thud, gentle, almost polite, because you don't need to slam a door when you own the building. "My father took the name Arclight when he founded the company," I said, My mother and I kept Hale. He believed the business should stand on merit, not family shortcuts. So I applied the same way anyone else would, under my qualifications, and I looked at Sloan long enough for her to understand that I remembered every syllable she'd used to shrink me. That night, I stood alone in my father's study at the family home in Larchmont, New York, my briefcase resting on the heavy desk where he'd built a global powerhouse, and I traced the worn leather the way you touch an old scar, half pain, half proof you survived, because my relationship with Leonard had always been complicated, love wrapped in expectation, pride wrapped in pressure. When I left after business school, he called it betrayal. When my company grew, he called it stubbornness. When Greenpole Strategies collapsed after an investor pulled out at the worst possible time, I called him expecting judgment, and instead he gave me the closest thing he'd ever offered as approval. Every real leader fails at least once. What matters is what you build after. And then 3 months later he was gone. A heart attack that came fast and left questions behind. 2 weeks after the funeral, the will read like a final lesson, 51% to me. But with a condition, I had to spend 3 months inside the company without revealing who I was, learn it from the inside before leading it. And inside my briefcase now sat a USB drive that Miles had handed me, evidence my father had compiled about Damon Price, inconsistencies, shell companies, money slipping away in quiet, surgical amounts, the kind of theft that wears a tie and still sleeps at night. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom wearing the same simple navy blazer from the interview, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I wanted the room to remember what it had tried to do with appearances. Sloan tried to regain control with an onboarding package. Damon played gracious while dripping challenge. And then, like a petty magic trick, Sloan slid a folder across the table, a curated autopsy of my failed startup, meant to embarrass me into shrinking. I opened it, nodded, closed it, and smiled, because the funniest thing about bullies in luxury suits is how shocked they get when you don't flinch. What this doesn't capture, I said, is what I learned. I lost money. Yes, I lost confidence for a while too, but I learned warning signs, investor risk, operational resilience, and I learned failure isn't fatal unless you let it be. And I watched the board members nod, while Sloan's little attack turned into my credibility. Afterward, Miles pulled me aside, warned me, "Be careful with Damon. He's been consolidating power since your father died." And I told him. Then we moved carefully, because revenge isn't screaming. Revenge is procedure, documentation, and timing. 3 days later, in my father's office, Evelyn Zhao brought personnel notes. Harold Keene, our elderly general counsel, brought urgency. Damon had scheduled an emergency committee meeting to restructure leadership, bypass me, bypass Miles, and turn my majority ownership into a ceremonial crown with no real sword. So I countered with my father's evidence. I distributed documents, international discrepancies, $37 million diverted through shell companies, and I named the thread that tied it together, Caleb Mercer, a man linked to those shell companies, the same man whose firm had influenced the investor that withdrew from Greenpole Strategies. And when the room tried to call it allegations, I smiled again and asked Harold to file a formal request for an independent forensic audit, selected by non-executive board members, the kind of move only a guilty person panics over. The vote passed. Damon seethed under a professional mask, and the company began to shake, quietly, deeply, the way a building shakes before people really. The foundation's been compromised. A week later, on a rain-soaked Friday, the skyline blurred behind my windows like the city itself didn't want to watch what was coming, and my phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn that made my stomach drop. Found the connection. Caleb Mercer is Damon's brother-in-law, different last name. And then she arrived with a folder, vendor approvals, Mercer advisory added despite red flags, personally signed by Damon, and then the detail that turned suspicion into something colder, evidence he accessed my father's medical records through the company health plan administrator 2 days before my father died. Before I could even decide whether to be sick or furious, my office door opened without a knock. Damon Price stood there, rain darkening his shoulders, tie loosened, hair slightly wrecked like he'd been wrestling himself in a mirror, and his eyes weren't polite anymore. They were predator dark, cornered. He shut the door slowly. The clicks sounded way too loud, and he said, "Working late, Chair," like the word tasted bitter. I kept my voice steady. because fear is what men like that feed on. We're reviewing financial patterns. You should join us. And I dropped the name Mercer Advisory into the air like a lit match. His jaw twitched. He glanced at Evelyn, then demanded privacy. I let Evelyn leave, but not before I told her to make sure Harold received everything. And when we were alone, the room felt smaller. He paced, stared at the storm, then turned and said, "You're like your father, stubborn, principled, blind to the bigger picture." And when I called it what it was, theft, sabotage, betrayal, he finally let the resentment leak out. 30 years of I stayed. You left. 30 years of thinking loyalty entitled him to ownership. And then I said the thing that had been burning in my throat for days. He confronted you the night he died, didn't he? He froze, just long enough, then admitted it. He found discrepancies. We argued. His heart gave out. I never touched him. And the words didn't absolve him. They only proved what kind of man he was. The kind who can kill you with stress and still call it an accident. He tried to threaten me, told me I had suspicions, not criminal proof, told me the board would paint me as an inexperienced daughter, told me to walk away. And that's when the calm settled over me, the kind of calm that arrives when you've already made peace with the hardest part. I reached down, pressed a small button inside my father's old briefcase, and a tiny red light stopped blinking. "That's where you're wrong," I said, quietly. "This entire conversation has been recorded." His face went blank. Then fear cracked through. He sputtered about legality, and I told him, still calm, "New York is a one-party consent state." And right on cue, my door opened again. Special Agent Tessa Ramirez stepped in with 2 officers, Harold Keene behind her, and the room finally felt like it could breathe. "Damon Price," she said, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice. Additional charges may follow." And when the cuffs closed around his wrists, he looked at me with hatred and something that almost resembled respect, because he knew he'd walked into a trap built out of patience, paperwork, and his own ego. As they let him out, I didn't gloat. I couldn't. Not really. Because there's tragedy in watching someone you once trusted reveal what they've been hiding. But I did say one last thing, clear, final. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm honoring my father's legacy, including accountability. The storm outside softened like the world was exhaling, and in the reflection of the glass I could almost see my father behind me, stern face, softened eyes, and I whispered, "We protected what mattered." After that, we cleaned house. Sloan Wexler was placed on administrative leave, later demoted after cooperating. The audit committee tightened controls. Board members who backed the power grab resigned. And we rebuilt, not with slogans, with systems, merit-based hiring, real ethics oversight, and a culture where a person's worth wasn't measured by labels. 1 year later, at the Leadership Summit in the Marrow Hotel under the theme Substance Over Surface, the company was thriving, stock at historic highs, sustainability metrics leading the industry. And when Miles Arclight introduced me to a nervous young engineer, Hannah Cross, plainly dressed, holding a worn portfolio, brilliant eyes that didn't match the room's luxury, I felt the cycle trying to repeat itself, and I refused to let it. "Their loss, our gain," I told her, and I meant it, because that's how closure looks sometimes, not fireworks, but the decision to become the person you needed when you were standing alone in a glass room being laughed at. So here's what I'm left with, after the arrests, the audits, the applause, the quiet nights where grief still shows up uninvited, and after the company finally felt clean again. Justice was served, the bad actor paid the price, and my father's work survived. But let me ask you this, honestly, where do we draw the line between righteous retaliation and moral compromise? If you have the chance to record the truth, to set a trap, to let someone reveal themselves, is it always right, because the outcome is good, or do the methods matter just as much as the ending? And if you were in my seat, would you call it justice, or would you call it something darker wearing the mask of it?